Welcome to this press conference on Biodiversity Day. We would like to inform you today about the importance of healthy ecosystems for climate protection. I would like to welcome the participants on the panel. Steffi Lemke is Germany's Federal Minister for the Environment. Welcome, Ms. Lemke. Elisabeth Maruma-Bremer is Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And as you know, the next CBD COP will start in December in Montreal, so we have something to look to be happy about. Joan Carling is a human rights expert, indigenous activist and executive director of the Indigenous People's Rights on the panel. And then we have time for your questions. And Minister Lemke, the floor is yours.
Ja, einen herzlichen Dank für die Begrüßung und herzlich willkommen hier an Sie alle im deutschen Pavillon auf der Weltklimakonferenz in Sharm El-Sheikh und auch einen herzlichen Gruß an die Zuschauer in Deutschland. Unsere Pressekonferenz wird im Livestream übertragen. Elisabeth Bremer und John Carling möchte ich sehr danken, dass Sie uns hier am Biodiversitätstag auf der Klimakonferenz besuchen. Bei der COP27 und gerade heute am Biodiversitätstag, der das erste Mal auf einer Klima-COP stattfindet, brauchen wir einerseits ein klares Bekenntnis zum Übereinkommen von Paris und den Reduktionszielen von Paris. Und diese Ziele können wir aber nur mit intakten, mit gesunden Ökosystemen erreichen und ihrem Beitrag, den diese Ökosysteme zum Klimaschutz leisten. Die drei großen ökologischen Krisen unserer Zeit, die Klimakrise, die Krise des Artenaussterbens und auch die Krise der globalen Verschmutzung, sie hängen untrennbar miteinander zusammen und deshalb sind auch die Lösungen für diese drei Krisen untrennbar miteinander verbunden. Wir brauchen deshalb einerseits Reduktion von CO2-Emissionen und andererseits die natürlichen Klimaschützer, die natürlichen Klimaspeicher, die einerseits Kohlenstoff speichern und auf der anderen Seite die biologische Vielfalt erhalten und dafür auch einen Beitrag für den Schutz des Wasserhaushaltes leisten und für die indigenen Völker letztendlich die Lebensgrundlage darstellen, die in besonders artenreichen Systemen leben. Deshalb ist es notwendig, die Ergebnisse der COP hier in Ägypten zusammenzuführen mit der COP
combine the findings of this COP with the CBD COP in December in Montreal. We are going to negotiate the new post-2020 biodiversity framework there. Nature-based solutions create synergies between the major biological crises of our times. That is why I want to have nature-based solutions being included in the cover decisions of the climate COP here in Egypt, because we need to build a bridge between the climate COP here and the CBD COP. That is of utmost importance. Those two crises are intertwined. That is why we can say that after COP is before the next COP, and we need to build a bridge between those two COPs. The global framework that is being negotiated at CBD COP15 also has to contribute to climate action. In concrete terms, this means that we need to see a widespread restoration of degraded ecosystems to at least 3 billion hectares of our land and seas. Second, an efficient protection of at least 30% of land and ocean for intact ecosystems. And third, an efficient and widespread and also quick implementation of nature-based solutions. At international level, Germany will provide 6 billion euros per year from 2026 on. 1.5 billion euros will be provided to biodiversity conservation from these 6 billion. That is why we send out a clear signal for support for this COP. I would also like to thank the Egypt COP presidency for hosting the first time the Biodiversity Day at the COP, and also for launching the global initiative on nature-based solutions in ACT. Germany is supporting this initiative and will also be a partner to this initiative. We will also be co-host this initiative, and we also want to promote a broad support and anchoring of this issue in the climate negotiations. This afternoon, we will have a side event, and together with my Egypt homologue, Farad, and other committed partners, we will present this initiative for nature-based solutions. The European Union also increased its commitment to nature-based solutions through the LULUCF regulation. This regulation promotes ambitious goals for nature-based solutions and will also increase its ambitions through the EU Green Deal on the way to becoming carbon neutral by 2050. The EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 is another key element of the Green Deal, where 20 billion euros per year will be invested in. Its goals include the protection of 30% of land and oceans, as well as the reduction of the pesticide use by 50% and the restoration of nature, as well as the obligation to restore 25,000 kilometers of rivers and to plant 3 billion additional trees. So the field of action of our action program on nature-based solutions for climate and biodiversity that will be having 4 billion euros by 2026 will support us in our negotiations at the two COPs. And the international initiative with the International Climate Action Initiative, ICI, Germany has been supporting many countries in our many projects in our partner countries on nature-based solutions. That is why ICI has been supporting since 2013 the global ICCA support initiative. As part of this international initiative, we have been supporting indigenous and local groups in 45 countries, and that is why I'm quite delighted to have our colleagues up here with us representing these initiatives. Now I would like to pass the floor on to Ms. Bremer.
Mrs. Bremer, it's your turn. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and many thanks for organizing this event on this Biodiversity Day, clearly making the links and connection between loss of biodiversity and climate change. Many thanks, and many thanks for the support you have demonstrated just now in terms of increasing resources for implementation of both through nature-based solution, but for the core benefits between the two crises. For too long, biodiversity loss and climate change have been looked as two separate issues. But the events of the recent years have clearly demonstrated how the two crises are directly, intrinsically connected. We have seen increasing floods, to droughts, to heat waves, to wildfires. Yes, the media, the public will talk, it is climate change. but we need to remember, where are all these disasters happening? They are all happening on this planet, on this earth, on the ecosystem, where biodiversity is. So that by itself needs to give us that thinking. Yes, we are talking of climate change, but wildfire happens on the ground. The floods, the droughts are on the ground. And this is where biodiversity ecosystem is. And we can clearly immediately see the links and connection between the two crises. And that also shows us that we cannot solve solutions to climate change in isolation to biodiversity, or biodiversity in isolation to climate change. The two have to be looked together, in fact, together with other environmental crises, particularly pollution, land degradation, desertification. All these multiple crises are connected. And we cannot deal with climate change, for instance, without looking at land degradation, desertification. And this is on the ground again, where biodiversity ecosystem is. So solutions for the two and all other multiple crises, what we're observing today, need to be looked together in an integrated fashion, in a synergetic fashion. 1, 2, that's why we're, in terms of solution, we need also to continue to strengthen our thinking beyond ministries and departments. We need whole of society, whole of government approach. Again, because of the connection between. We cannot deal with let's say, climate change without looking or talking to the ministries of agriculture, ministries of fisheries. And we cannot deal with land issues and say this is the purview of ministries or Department of Environment and not agriculture, fisheries, or planning. And we, again, even at national level, that connection need to be seen, because the solutions need to be looked at an integrated fashion and involving all stakeholders. Sadly, 97% of the current challenges are man-made. So we human beings, me and you and all of us, we have contributed to the 90% degradation globally, which is rather a shame. But of course, the recent events remind us that we do need to change even the way we look at things, the way we do things, and how then we can take action in an integrated fashion. The minister here has mentioned the importance of this COP to the biodiversity COP coming up in less than 3 weeks' time. Because if we are saying climate change and desertification are connected, it means the outcome coming from climate 27 will have direct influence to the negotiations and debates going to happen in Montreal in December. So again, as government representatives, we need to look at that. And this again shows that connection. We know here there is current discussions going on nature-based solution for climate change. Biodiversity, of course, they will tend to refer to ecosystem-based approach. But let's face it, we are talking of both as solutions to both climate change and biodiversity. And if 30% of climate mitigation is expected to come from biodiversity conservation, again, we see the importance of biodiversity from the climate angle and vice versa. And again, if biodiversity is to provide that carbon storage needed for climate change, again, the solutions to climate change, we need to look back at biodiversity conservation and make that connection. And this connection is squarely also being made by the negotiators of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to be adopted in December. There is a specific draft target on climate, but climate is just one. I mean, the targets on sustainable agriculture, sustainable fisheries, reducing extinction of species, all these are relevant to climate mitigation and adaptation. And if we say 50% of the global GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature, $44 trillion or $10 trillion will accrue by 2030 per year is the result of from biodiversity or nature accruing about 395 million jobs by 2030. Clearly, we see the importance of biodiversity, but then to be able to accrue these benefits, then biodiversity should not be plundered as we have done. It is not there to plunder for free. It has a cost, and the cost can be the cost to the planet, to the human beings, and our own well-being. So if I may give just few examples from the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, draft target 8 is looking at squarely supporting and contributing to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Draft target 2 is looking at restoration of the ecosystem and biodiversity. For instance, on climate change is how then the target is looking at minimizing the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and increasing its resilience for mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. And we have a draft target looking at also harmful subsidies. Subsidies have been a major impact on biodiversity, and therefore proposing, repurposing, redirecting harmful subsidies to biodiversity into sustainable biodiversity outcomes or activities. And that, by the framework, is looking at least reducing $500 million per year of harmful subsidies. We know harmful subsidies go to, for instance, in agriculture, $2.6 trillion per year. Investments just put in harmful agricultural production. If just half of that is repurposed into positive biodiversity activities, again, that, Your Excellence, will increase that financial resources we are talking about. So we really need to come out of this climate COP27, moving into CBD or biodiversity COP15 with stronger message of synergies between climate change and biodiversity, or the Climate Convention and Biodiversity Convention, and more so even through spatial planning, which is actually the first draft target under the framework. We need to maximize the benefits for biodiversity conservation, climate mitigation, and reduce costs wherever is possible. And these synergies or call for synergies have both been underlined by IPCC report, by IPBS report, including a joint IPCC-IPBS workshop held last year. So the scientists have also been clear. The messages from them have been clear. Now it's on the ground action to really demonstrate that there are core benefits in looking at these two issues together. So how then can we avoid and reverse the loss and degradation of not just carbon, but also species-rich ecosystems on land and in the ocean, which are of highest importance for the combined both biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation with large adaptation core benefits. Let's look at afforestation, which involves planting trees in ecosystems that are not historically been, have not historically been forest, or reforestation with monocultures, especially with exotic tree species that can contribute to climate change mitigation, although at times can be detrimental to biodiversity. But we need to have that to ensure we do have that clear benefits and do not have for both. We cannot forget indigenous peoples and local communities who are at the heart of and involved in the conservation in our actions. Many studies have clearly shown and demonstrated the impact of protective effect of indigenous communities' territories, which are better conserved than many other areas. So recognizing indigenous rights to land, considering the interest of indigenous interests in our programs, and supporting those territorial governance strategies for indigenous will be part of the essential success of implementation of biodiversity conservation, also for climate mitigation and adaptation. So I hope this Biodiversity Day will all help us to really make the connection. And as we carry our bags to Montreal, we continue that message from climate COP27 to COP15 as one roadmap for the common good of our human being, well-being, and our planet, which we only have one, and we know planet B. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mrema, for your remarks. Mrs. Carney, please.
Yes, thank you for the acknowledgement of the role and contributions of indigenous peoples to biodiversity. As indigenous peoples, we protect 80% of biodiversity in different ecosystems. But the reality on the ground is that we are facing different threats, including from climate actions. If we look at what's happening in indigenous territories now, I want to take the case that as we speak, thousands, more than 100,000 of Maasai pastoralists in Tanzania are facing eviction, the threat of eviction in the name of conservation, in the name of national parks. As we speak, many indigenous communities are going to lose their lands for the mining of transition minerals for the just transition. So from the perspective of indigenous peoples, the global crisis should be addressed in a coherent and holistic manner, putting at the center of our actions the protection of human rights, achieving social equity and sustainability. We cannot continue with this siloed approach to biodiversity and climate change. From our perspective, it is one and the same problem. And we need to tackle the root causes of climate change and biodiversity loss. We need to take action when environment defenders are being criminalized, killed, and put to jail when they are defending the environment and the biodiversity that supports us all as humanity. These are the realities on the ground. So when we talk of solutions to climate change, we have to stop the siloed approach. As I mentioned, even us as indigenous peoples, when we speak of our rights in the Sustainable Development Agenda, they tell us, go to Geneva. That's where the Human Rights Council are. If we raise our rights in relation to environment, they say go to Nairobi because that is where environment is being discussed. And when we talk of biodiversity protection, that our rights need to be protected for biodiversity protection, they say go to Montreal. And at the end, the solutions that are being proposed are harming us instead of supporting the way we protect biodiversity. We are treated as enemies. As I mentioned, hundreds of indigenous peoples are already killed in the name of climate action. We cannot afford to continue with this. We cannot afford to ignore the fact that indigenous peoples are at the front line of biodiversity conservation, and the respect and recognition of our rights is a prerequisite for us to be able to effectively address climate change and biodiversity. So when we talk of the synergy between climate change and biodiversity protection, we need to put indigenous peoples and rights holders also at the decision-making process, so that our perspectives, our values of conservation, our measures for building solidarity and cooperation are accounted, because that is what we need to move forward. The people, indigenous peoples and others, are calling for global solidarity for coherent action on the ground, for real solutions that will protect biodiversity. And that also means going away from the fortress conservation approach, where we are taken out of our territories in the name of climate change. We need policy reform to dismantle that kind of approach and ensure partnership with indigenous peoples under a whole of society approach and under a socially equitable solutions to climate change and biodiversity protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Harling. So now we...
Vielen herzlichen Dank. Jetzt haben Sie die Möglichkeit, Fragen zu stellen. Bitte heben Sie die Hand und warten Sie auf das Mikrofon. Die erste Frage hier vorne, zweite Reihe.
Thank you very much. Lukas Scheid for Table Media. So we're still discussing here in Sharm El-Sheikh the goals that have been made in Paris in 2015. So what can we learn from Paris, for Montreal, that we're not discussing the framework that is being decided on in Montreal in another 7 years, basically? So what are the learnings from Paris for the framework? Thank you.
Also, glaube ich, ein Benennender antworten soll.
Could you address your question?
Yes.
Goes it to the minister or
Yes.
to,
Yeah.
to all of the panel? Okay.
Okay, ich mache es kurz und versuche Ihre Frage
I
zu
will be
beantworten.
brief and try to respond to your question. The most important lesson we've learned is that we cannot continue discussing about goals for several years and afterwards about implementation, but we need to start with implementation now. We need to translate the goals into practice, and for Germany this means that we need to see our program of nature-based solutions
und dass wir, bevor die
real
COP in Montreal
terms.
startet, unsere
Before the COP in
internationale
Montreal, we need to substantially increase our international climate finance and biodiversity finance and ensure to directly start with implementation, and that is what we need to see, and we need an ambitious agreement for that. We need ambitious goals in Montreal.
Just to to ensure that climate change mitigation and adaptation should need to account for biodiversity protection instead as trade-off. And that should be clear in relation to the just transition and other measures for mitigation, such as forest conservation, which is also critical for climate change.
Thanks a lot. So I have a couple of questions. Please address whom you would like to answer because we have 10 minutes time and I would like to take all of you. The gentleman over here.
Merci beaucoup. Si je traduis, parle en français, quelqu'un peut traduire?
Excuse me?
If I speak French,
She wants to speak French.
translation. Voilà, merci beaucoup. Voilà, donc je suis Haruna Abarchi, je viens du Niger, je suis membre d'une organisation des peuples autochtones du Niger.
I didn't understand your name. My name is Luna Baisi, and I am from the indigenous people from Niger.
Et je suis très content de voir la collaboration entre la tentative de mettre en dialogue entre les changements climatiques et le dialogue et la biodiversité. Ça, c'est une très bonne chose.
I'm really happy to see that the linkage between climate change and biodiversity is made here today. This is a very important thing. Thank you for this.
Je voudrais juste préciser que pour ce qui concerne les communautés autochtones au Niger, nous souhaitons quand même qu'il y ait quelque chose dans ce sens-là, parce que comme l'a dit la dame, en tout cas les pastoralistes du Kenya ou de Tanzanie ont bénéficié de beaucoup de choses, mais au Niger, il n'y en a pas encore. Et je souhaite que la Germanie et d'autres programmes y pensent, parce que nous sommes traversés par le Sahel où les écosystèmes sont très fragiles.
Okay, so I would like to mention that in Niger, the autochthon communities, so indigenous people, don't yet profit from projects, but we are in the Sahel zone is traversing our country, and differently, it's different with Tanzania. And what other country did you mention? Quel autre pays? And the Maasai, Kenya.
This is a press conference. Please formulate a question.
Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah.
Do you have a question, sir?